The Prime Minister says his government will introduce tough criminal justice legislation this coming week. The announcement, largely centred around bail reforms, is part of the law enforcement agenda, fulfilling a promise that Mark Carney made in his spring election campaign.
We will bring in tougher sentences for violent and repeat offenders and invest in thousands of frontline officers to combat crime in all of its forms.
It represents a shift away from some criminal justice policies of the Trudeau-era Liberals, laws that Conservatives have criticized for repeatedly failing to protect Canadians. The proposed legislation includes reverse onus bail for major crimes where the accused must prove to the court why they can be trusted to be released, consecutive sentences for violent and repeat offenders so that multiple sentences cannot be served at the same time, harsher penalties for organized retail theft, and eliminating conditional sentences for people convicted of sexual offences, plus hiring 1,000 more RCMP personnel over the next 4 years. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has also made criminal justice a centerpiece of his agenda. The Conservatives have proposed their own bail reform legislation just last month. They've dismissed the government's announcement, saying it doesn't go far enough.
We don't need Mr. Carney to simply repeat more Liberal promises on reverse onus. We need to scrap Liberal bail. And here we are 7 months into his term. He has done nothing to scrap Liberal bail. Crime is raging in our streets, and the problem gets worse every day. It's another Liberal bait and switch.
Premiers have been pushing, too, for the federal government to act on the issue of bail. Municipal leaders across the country have also raised concerns that Canada's existing bail laws contribute to violence and public disorder, particularly in cities. They say repeat offenders are arrested, then quickly released while awaiting their court dates. Scott Gillingham is the mayor of Winnipeg, and he joins us now. Nice to see you, Mayor.
Thank you for having me.
You've been, like many people across the country, but you've been pushing for reform, changes to bail for quite some time. Now we at least have a sense of what is coming in the legislation being tabled next week. One of the changes is reverse onus that would force repeat offenders who have been charged with violent crime, violent car theft, assault, sexual assault, those kinds of things, to prove they deserve bail. Do you think that that is going to have a material impact on crime in Winnipeg?
Well, I'm glad to see that reverse onus provision in the what was announced by the Prime Minister. And first of all, I want to say I'm grateful that the Prime Minister and his government seem to be listening to mayors, police chiefs, premiers, and the public who've been, calling for these changes. Ultimately, if we can keep repeat violent offenders off of our streets, there's a better likelihood, obviously, that our communities will be safer. So I'm really glad to see now that the onus will be on the defense and the individual who's got a history of repeat, violent offenses. The onus will be on them to prove, why they should get bail.
A couple of the other measures we're expecting in the legislation, imposing consecutive sentencing for violent and repeat offenders, as you just pointed out there, removing conditional sentencing for people convicted of sexual offenses. So those are some of the measures. Are there other things that you would hope to see in the legislation that would make a difference?
Well, one of the other measures I think that was also mentioned was that, an emphasis on harsher penalties for organized retail crime. And I think that is very important as well. I've been doing weekly bulletins of historic cases of individuals who have breached their court orders and gone on to commit violence or other crimes while they've been on bail. And in one of those instances, we had an individual who actually, stabbed a security guard while they were committing, a retail crime. That was an individual out on bail. Had they not been granted bail, that, crime would not have happened. And this organized retail crime, some people can think, well, it's the violent crime that is more important than the retail crime. But those seemingly smaller crimes, the retail crime, if you let the small things go, they become big things. And so I think, Canadians and certainly Winnipeggers have been calling for, a broad range of sweeping reforms that will include all of these crimes.
As you said, you've been doing these bulletins weekly, demonstrating examples of people who had been released and are committing crime. But, Stats Canada does show that the amount and severity of police-reported crime went down last year. It had increased over 3 years, and then it went down again. So I wonder whether you think these incidents that you've taken the time to highlight are actually in the minority, and perhaps things are turning even before the bail reform goes into place.
even if they're in the minority, that's really cold comfort to the individuals who are victims of crime. We had this horrendous incident here at the beginning of September in Manitoba at Holowata First Nation, where an individual who was out on bail went on to stab multiple members of that community. And now the individual ultimately, died in a car crash. But there's an instance where an entire community and family members were victimized by someone who is on bail. So even if the stats are, that most people on bail don't recommit, the problem is too many people, and that's what I've been showing through my weekly bulletins, too many people who are on bail go on to commit violence. In fact, one incident that I shared was an individual who's convicted of 24 violent crimes over 11 years, and in that time breached their court orders 12 times. So the question that Winnipeggers and Canadians should be asking is, why is an individual like that, who repeats violent offenses, out on bail?
So the other part of that, of course, is resources. I looked at the stats for Manitoba. More than 70% of inmates being held in jails right across the province are on remand. And I wonder, do you think that the province has the resources, the funding required to put this kind of bail reform into place, given that there are a lot of people waiting to see what their fate will hold inside the justice system?
You bring up a very good point, Rosemary. And I have said, I think every part of the justice system needs to do its part. So we as a city, as municipalities, we need to do our part in making sure we have the right investment in policing. Yeah. Provincial government needs to make the right investment in the prosecution, in the crowns, to make sure there's enough crowns to handle the workload. Mm-hmm. And I think, as the federal government makes these changes, there could be more work that comes to the crowns of the province of Manitoba and other provinces as well. So the provinces and Manitoba as well will need to make sure that we've got the right investment and enough investment in our crowns and our prosecutions to handle the workload.
So I'll just end on this. I think you're going to testify at the committee. You were going to do that even before this. But what other piece is missing, do you think? Or are you waiting to see, maybe the legislation will have it, but what is the one other thing that you would hope to see that will make a difference?
You're right. I'm waiting to see what the legislation ultimately is. As I said, I and many other mayors were really pleased to hear the Prime Minister make the announcement this week about the changes that are coming. But ultimately, we want to see the details. I will be in Ottawa to appear before the Justice Committee on this issue and the call for bail reform, and continue to cite examples of here in Winnipeg where people have gone on bail, breached orders, and committed violence. Ultimately, Rosemary, Winnipeg needs to be a safer community. The cities across Canada, all communities across Canada need to be safer places, and public safety needs to be the priority.
Okay, Scott Gillingham, the Mayor of Winnipeg, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Trudeau broke the criminal code when he took a free vacation from someone with whom he had government business. It's just like, it's right there in the criminal code. If the RCMP had been doing its job and not covering up for him, then he would have been criminally charged.
I don't take any orders from any political individual. And as far as his comment with regards to senior management, I would invite Mr. Poilievre to meet with us and to meet with the people who run this great organization, 32,000 strong.
Pierre Poilievre, in a podcast appearance there, claiming that the RCMP shielded former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau from criminal charges. Poilievre provided no evidence to support those claims. Claims, as you heard, that the RCMP says are false. And then on Friday, a former top aide to Stephen Harper, Dimitri Soudis, wrote a piece for the Toronto Star saying Poilievre is, quote, dismantling the Conservative Party. Let's bring in our Sunday Scrum. Aaron Wary, a senior writer for the CBC, and Tonda McCharles, the Ottawa bureau chief for the Toronto Star. Gary Mason, columnist for the Globe and Mail. He's in Vancouver. Tonda, I'll start with you. It was one thing for Pierre Poilievre to make those claims, and I should point out that he was referring to past leadership, not the current commissioner. But it was another thing then for Dimitri Soudis, who is still a player in the Conservative environment, to go after him in that op-ed in your paper.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a few things going on there. Yeah. Leaving aside the fact that Mr. Poilievre's office had to later clarify that he was going after past leadership of the RCMP. He's also still quite fixated on Justin Trudeau as the Liberal leader. Look, I guess two things I want to point out before I get to the political thing of what Dimitri Soudis wrote. The idea that the RCMP is politicized comes up on both sides of the aisle when it suits them, frankly. I mean, the RCMP continues to investigate a number of federal contracting issues under the Liberal government. When the 2005-06 campaign was going on, the Liberals were the ones who felt that they were, affected negatively by an RCMP decision to acknowledge an investigation into an income trust tax change at the time. Look, there's always allegations about politicization of the RCMP. And I think, though, that in the 30 years that I was covering the RCMP in this town, I'm often struck that whenever politics intersects with investigations, if anything, the RCMP is often naive about the fallout or oblivious to the political fallout. But those accusations are very common, very familiar. Now, what it does, though, do is, having given sort of a platform for a senior Conservative, a former spokesperson for a former Prime Minister, to say Mr. Poilievre is all about grievance and not governance, that was really interesting to me. And that opens a whole other question about the politics going on here.
Yeah, we should say that Stephen Harper's spokesperson made it very clear that he did not support the comments by Dimitri Soudis. These are just his views, personal views. Gary, what did you make of either of the pieces of this story?
Well, I was struck by many of the same things Tonda's referred to. I mean, Soudis said that, the party that Stephen Harper sort of built and launched into government was based on substance, integrity, and maturity. And that's never really seemed to be the party that Pierre Poilievre has wanted to build since taking over as leader of the federal Conservatives. He does seem more comfortable, leading a grievance movement than a mature and respected political institution. Maybe he just feels that this is grounds that he's more comfortable around, but he sure sounds more comfortable, talking like Donald Trump in many of these, in many of these same references that you hear Trump make. But one thing that's kind of interesting is that there's a new Abacus poll that has come out, and it shows the two parties, relatively neck and neck, tied. But whenever Trump is front and center in the political conversation, the Liberal vote share among people 60 and older goes up. And right now, that vote, they have about an 11-point lead among Canadians 60 and older who are just simply turned off by Donald Trump or anything to do with Donald Trump. So it's kind of an interesting strategy for the Conservative leader to want to be linked to Trump when there's so much negativity around his name in Canada at the moment.
Aaron?
Yeah, just to go back to the comments themselves, I don't think that, the suggestion after the fact that this was specific or something specific to the previous RCMP commissioner changes much about the substance of what he said. To suggest that there was a politically motivated cover-up and to do so without evidence is an incredibly serious charge and a potentially dangerous charge for the institution and for faith in the Canadian justice system. And so I think there's an incredible onus now on Mr. Poilievre to explain on what basis he was making these comments and on what evidence he was making these comments. I do think, one of the storylines in the last election was this idea of whether or not Pierre Poilievre was too much like Donald Trump. And, Conservatives may balk at that idea, but I think, if these comments remind people of Donald Trump, I think that's Mr. Poilievre's own fault. As for what goes on next in terms of the Conservative Party, I do think it is interesting. The question that Mr. Soudis kind of raises is whether, Pierre Poilievre has sort of pushed things too far for Conservatives now, whether they still kind of want to support this kind of politics. And I think that is an interesting question, for MPs and for sort of Conservatives, established Conservatives who have served in previous governments. Is this the kind of politics they want to pursue?
As he faces a leadership review in January. Yeah, Tonda.
I was struck, that comment by Mr. Poilievre came at the 28-minute mark into about a 32-minute interview with interviewers he was clearly ideologically comfortable with. And he sort of went off on that tangent about the RCMP and covering up. I wonder, if we ask ourselves what's really going on here and why is it happening now, to a certain extent, those comments will appeal to a certain part of Poilievre's base, to everybody's comments here, that there is some portion of the Conservative voting coalition that does like Trump. But there is definitely an impact also on the effort to broaden the coalition. And I guess, I kind of see Mr. Poilievre as too skilled a performer, a political performer, to have just casually tossed that off. I think that he is pretty deliberate in most of what he says. And I think he's made a calculation that to get through his leadership review in January and to stop sort of, any agitation about his leadership, he's going to prove to them that he remains the person that they thought could lead the party into the last election, and many of them still believe can win them a next vote. That's the bigger question. I do see a lot of this throwing red meat to the base sort of argument as supporting the fact that he's determined to win first the leadership review in January.
Okay, Erin Wherry, Tana McCharles, Gary Mason, thanks for spending part of your Sunday with me. Talk soon.